Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Does it sound good in the back? Right on. Well, I'd like to welcome you, everyone, to this afternoon's lecture entitled The Pure Violence of Revolutionism by the distinguished scholar Saul Morson, whom we are tremendously excited to be hosting here today. Before we get started, I'd like to ask everyone to please silence your cell phones and all other electronic devices. I am Aaron Zubia of the Department of Politics and International Affairs, and this lecture is the first this fall in the Tocqueville program's signature course and lecture series, which this year is on the revolutionary spirit and the human future. And I will take a moment to describe the work of the Tocqueville program. The Tocqueville program exists to sponsor serious and open engagement with the moral and philosophical questions at the heart of political life. If you are looking for a genuine liberal education while at Furman, the Tocqueville program is for you, and we would love for you to get involved, and there are several ways in which you can get involved. The Tocqueville program sponsors courses in the history of political thought and oversees the Society of Tocqueville Fellows, a select group of students that is chosen by competitive application. Tocqueville Fellows meet several times per year to discuss contemporary political issues in light of the perspective that is gained from the sustained study of political philosophy. The Tocqueville program works closely with the Political Thought Club, which is a very lively independent student group that meets each Friday at 4 p.m. in Johns Hall 101. There we discuss great texts that pertain to the study of politics. The Political Thought Club's theme this year is politics and transcendence, a theme we will be approaching through the study of short stories by Flannery O'Connor, Leo Tolstoy, and others, as well as through the reading of speeches by thinkers including Martin Luther King Jr. and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. You are always welcome to join us Fridays at 4 p.m. in Johns 101. And you are also welcome to join us after this lecture and after the Q&A for a reception that will be held right through there. I believe the walls will raise up and a feast will await us. The Tocqueville program's vibrant intellectual community here on campus is made possible by the generous gifts of individuals and philanthropic organizations. I want to thank our sponsors, Ginny and Sandy McNeil, Beth and Ravenel Curry, the AWC Family Foundation, the family of Jane Gage Hipp, the Strata Network, the Strata Education Network, and many others, including former students who support the Tocqueville program. Today's lecture is part of the Ernest J. Walters Lecture Series in Political Thought. The Walters Lecture Series was established in 2001 to honor the life and legacy of Professor J. Walters. Professor Walters dedicated his professional career to Furman University, teaching in the Department of Political Science for 27 years. After his death in 1997, members of the Political Science Department decided that there could be no better way to honor his contribution than to continue his legacy through yearly visits by distinguished lecturers in the area of political thought. This annual memorial lectureship has been established by the students Professor Walters inspired and the friends and family he cherished. The theme of this year's course and lecture series is the revolutionary spirit and the human future. Populism, the pandemic, resurgent socialism have recently brought Americans to ask revolutionary questions, to reconsider the nation's founding narrative and its very identity, past and future. America, of course, was birthed in revolution. In this course and lecture series, we ask, how should our country's revolutionary origin inform our country's self-understanding? What distinguishes the American Revolution from other great historical revolutions? We will ponder the causes and the consequences of the revolutionary spirit as it has developed since 1776. And we have with us today Saul Morson, who has written extensively on many topics in literary theory and in the history of ideas, including, and this is pertinent to the lecture today, the great Russian literary tradition and the debate between the great Russian writers and the Russian intelligentsia. in the late 19th century, leading up to the Russian Revolution in 1917. Gary Saul Morson is the Lawrence B. Dumas Professor of the Arts and Humanities and Professor of Russian Literature at Northwestern University, the author or editor of 20 books on Russian writers, on the nature of time, on the role of quotations in culture, and other topics. Gary Saul Morson has won Best Book Awards from the American Comparative Literature Association and the American Association of Professors of Slavic and East European Languages. For many years, his course on Tolstoy and Dostoevsky was the largest course at Northwestern University and the largest on Russian literature in North America. And two of his most recent books, both of which were co-written with Morton Shapiro, are Sense and Sensibility, What Economics Can Learn from the Humanities, and Minds Wide Shut, How the New Fundamentalisms Divide Us. Now, we are very happy to have him here. Please join me in welcoming Gary Saul Morson.
Thank you for such a generous introduction, Aaron, and I'm really delighted to be here and to see so many interested and interesting faces. It's the first time to Furman, and I'm impressed. The talk I'm going to give today, The Revolutionist Pure Violence, comes from a book I'm writing on what we can learn from the Russian experience over the past 150 years. And this is a little section from it. You know, revolution is a big part of Russian history and Russian thought. So the present talk is divided into 12 short parts. I tell you that so that at each point you will know how much more you have to sit through. It begins with a quotation from the current cultural theorist Slavoj Žižek, which reads, "In every authentic revolutionary explosion, there is an element of pure violence. That is, an authentic political revolution cannot be measured by the standard to what extent life got better for the majority afterward. It is a goal in itself. One should directly admit revolutionary violence as a liberating end in itself." And the first section of this talk is called The Mystique of Revolution. The revolutionary Ian Steinberg, who joined the early Bolshevik government, said, quote, "Russia at the dawn of the 20th century knew no more magic word than revolution. There was enchantment in the very sound of the word. Even as they pronounced the sacred words, 'Long live the revolution,' Russians felt obscurely that they were already halfway to liberation," unquote. Apart from any goals, the idea of revolution itself proved irresistible to many. Most educated people succumbed to the revolutionary spirit. The memoirist Nadezhda Mandelstam recalled, quote, "My brother Yevgeny Yakovlevich used to say that the decisive part in the subjugation of the intelligentsia was played not by terror or bribery, though God knows there was enough of both, but by the word revolution, which none of them could bear to give up. It is a word to which whole nations have succumbed, and its force was such that one wonders why our rulers still needed prisons and capital punishment," unquote. The mystique of revolution shaped Russian life in the decades preceding the revolutions of 1917. Russia was the first country where terrorist became an honorable, if dangerous, profession, commanding especially great prestige among the young. In fact, it was often a family occupation going on for generations. The extent of terror was astonishing. As historian Anna Geifman notes in her study entitled "Thou Shalt Kill: Revolutionary Terrorism in Russia, 1894 to 1917, I quote from her, "During a one-year period, beginning in October 1905, a total of 3,611 government officials of all ranks were killed and wounded throughout the empire. By the end of 1907, the total number of state officials who had been killed or injured came to nearly 4,500. The picture becomes a particularly terrifying one in consideration of the fact that an additional 2,180 private individuals were killed and 2,350 wounded of private people in terrorist attacks between 1905 and 1907. In the month of October 1906 alone, 362 politically motivated armed robberies took place, unquote. Killing and maiming, that is, throwing sulfuric acid into the face, evolved into a sport, quote, where victims were just moving targets. In 1906 to 7, these wood choppers, as one revolutionary labeled them, competed to see who committed the most robberies and murders and often exhibited jealousy over other success, unquote. One anecdote told of an editor asked if the biography of the new governor should be run, replying, "No, don't bother, save it for the obituary." After 1905, terror became so commonplace that newspapers published new sections wholly devoted to assassinations and expropriations. That was the polite name for armed robberies. In the town of Białystok, one combat organization consisted entirely of school children. About 1/4 of terrorists were women who were especially valued in the practice of sadistic cruelty. Robbery, extortion, and murder, the historian Anna Geifman says, became more common than traffic accidents. Part 2 is called Revolution for the Sake of Revolution. For many terrorists, goals and ideology were irrelevant. What they loved was revolutionary activity itself. Let us call this type of revolutionary a revolutionist. Time and again, the means for achieving a goal became the goal itself. If at first the end was a particular kind of society, and revolution was the means, revolution soon became the end. By the same logic, if at first revolution was the end, and terrorism the means, terrorism soon became the end in itself. The goal of terrorism was terrorism. No one symbolized the cult of revolution for its own sake more than Michael Bakunin, the founder of modern anarchism, but a revolutionary even before he embraced anarchism. He rushed to Paris to participate in the 1848 uprising, an experience that was his most blissful. He recalled, quote, "I was on my feet the whole day, took part in absolutely every meeting, gathering, club, procession, walk, demonstration. I inhaled with all my senses, with all my pores, the intoxicating atmosphere of revolution. It was a banquet without beginning or end," unquote. In his best-known work, entitled God and the State, Bakunin described the essence of humanness, the highest faculty of the soul, as rebellion. In persuading Adam and Eve to defy God, he explained, Satan made them truly human, so in a sense, it is Satan who is man's creator. The goal of rebellion does not really matter. In 1861, the writer Alexander Herzen, who was based in London, received a letter from Bakunin explaining that he had escaped from Siberia and had reached San Francisco. The letter immediately switched to plans for revolution. He's just out of prison, right? Quote, "I await my fiancée, revolution. We will be really happy. That is, we will become ourselves only when the whole world is engulfed in fire," unquote. The best known of all terrorists operating in Russia, Bakunin was mostly outside, Boris Savinkov, was also a novelist. And it remains unclear whether he wrote novels to record his terrorist achievements or practiced terrorism to obtain material for his novels. He started both careers at the same time and kept clippings of both. Savinkov did not care about ideology and would terrorize for anyone. Bolotov, the hero of his novel What Never Happened, explains, quote, "I live for murder, only for murder." And Bolotov describes one of his comrades, quote, "His whole existence lay in the work, in terror. He had fallen in love. Yes, fallen in love with terror, unquote. For revolutionists, aiding workers and peasants was at best secondary. One of the first women terrorists, Vera Zasulik, recalled that, quote, sympathy for the sufferings of the people did not move me. I had never heard of the horrors of serfdom where I grew up, and I don't think there were any, unquote. Savinkov observed that the famous terrorist Dora Brilliant, quote, lived only by one thing, her faith in terror. Questions of program did not interest her, unquote. In Savinkov's novel, Pale Horse, terrorists discuss the morality of terrorism. It is noteworthy that the question they address is not whether terrorism is justified, that's a foregone conclusion, but which justification to pick. In that case, why not dispense with justification? Or as George, the hero of Pale Horse, asks, does the very need for justifications, quote, perhaps hide some cowardice, unquote? Part 3 is called Risk and Thrill. If relieving suffering is beside the point, why would someone kill and risk her life? What motivates the revolutionists to engage in terror? One motive was the thrill of risk itself. According to Savinkov, a fundamental feature of a famous terrorist, quote, was his daring. The more dangerous the enterprise, the more eager he was to undertake it, unquote. In his novel, August 1914, Alexander Solzhenitsyn depicts Dmitry Bagrov, the real assassin of pre-revolutionary Russia's last great prime minister, Peter Stolypin, as a compulsive gambler. At Monte Carlo, he frequented the high-stakes room. He enthused, quote, there was no thrill like it. In half an hour, you could live through a whole lifetime, unquote. Terrorism was just another form of roulette. And thinker Peter Struve observed that gambling psychology conditioned many to believe progress requires not patient work, but is instead, quote, a jackpot to be won at the gambling table of history, unquote. The hero of the novel, of Savinkov's novel, Pale Horse, asks, what would I be doing if I were not involved in terror? I don't want to live a peaceful life. What's my life without the joyful awareness that worldly laws are not for me, unquote. The lives of victims, including mere bystanders, do not matter. Geifman quotes one terrorist, quote, I cannot live peacefully. I like danger so as to feel the thrill, unquote. In his essay, The Intelligentsia and the Revolution, the really great poet Alexander Blok found in violence an antidote to, quote, the boredom, the triviality of ordinary life, unquote. The goal matters less than what he called the roar. In Blok's view, the artistic spirit even demands the destruction of art itself. Quote, do not be alarmed when citadels, palaces, pictures, books are destroyed because, can't you hear it? There is the music. Which is more frightening, the arson and lynchings in one camp or this oppressive lack of musicality in the other, unquote. Blok concludes, quote, with your whole body, your whole heart, your whole consciousness, listen to the revolution, unquote. Terrorists may sense themselves beyond all social definition, as if they were outside society and outside of time, a condition anthropologist Victor Turner called liminality. On his way to assassinate the Tsar, Andrei, the hero of terrorist Stepniak's novel, The Career of a Nihilist, senses his total outsiderhood from the living. Quote, while still a living man in full command of his mental and physical energy, he had the strange sensation of being already dead, looking upon himself and the whole world with the unruffled, somewhat pitying serenity of a stranger, unquote. This feeling of living posthumously frees him from ordinary concerns and places him beyond good and evil. He becomes a Superman. Liminality, a condition of absolute in-betweenness and transitionality, when anything seems possible, readily becomes addictive, like gambling. Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago lives to regret his brief enthusiasm for revolution. Quote, something definite should have been achieved, but it turns out that those who inspired the revolution aren't at home in anything except turmoil. For them, transitional periods, worlds in the making, are an end in themselves. But man is born to live, not to prepare for life. Part 4 is called Metaphysical Hatred. Bloch's excitement at blowing up cathedrals exemplifies the pleasure afforded by sheer destruction. One might suppose that those engaged in killing and stealing would have a specific set of changes to implement, but it was usually considered bad form to insist on a specific program. As Bakunin famously explained, it is the will to destroy itself that is a creative will, unquote. Such revolutionaries, historian Richard Stites observes, envisaged, quote, a clarifying and purifying destruction, the creation of a charred landscape of ruined churches and museums. For these people, the revolution was to be a long black light of devastation. Their black banner, that was the flag of the anarchists, signified nothingness, the void, annihilation, unquote. They recommended an alliance with what terrorist Sergei Nechayev enthusiastically called, quote, the evil world of brigands, who in Russia comprise the true and only revolutionaries, unquote. One reason it is hard to count the number of terrorist crimes is that so many criminals operated under the banner of terrorism, while terrorists, having expropriated property for their party, sometimes went into business for themselves. When the goal is pure violence, why not also profit by it? Such revolutionism, the philosopher Semyon Frank remarked, quote, reflects the metaphysical absolutization of the value of destruction, unquote, fed by a sort of metaphysical hatred which can never be satisfied. It feeds on itself. Frank explained that, quote, hatred is always the psychological accompaniment of destruction and displaces other impulses in psychic life. It operates even in the gentlest person because it is not in any way personal. His faith obliges him to hate. Hatred serves as the most passionately ethical impulse of his life, unquote. Memoirists who knew Lenin stressed how sheer hatred shaped his choice of violence, not when necessary, but whenever possible. Lenin leapt to hatred and relied on it for energy. Whereas whenever other revolutionaries disagreed with him, recalled Bolshevik Nikolai Valentinov, quote, Lenin became, in his own words, rabid. He violently hated all of them, wanted to, in his words, smash their faces in, stick the convict's badge on them, insult them, trample them underfoot, to spit on them, any revolutionary disagreed with him. Defeating, even killing them, was not enough, as it would have been if the security of the new regime was the sole purpose of violence. While serving in the Bolshevik government, Steinberg noted how Lenin's face brightened at the very thought of mass extermination. He quotes Lenin's demand for, quote, the cruelest revolutionary terror, unquote. Lenin enthused, quote, from now on, the hymn of the working class will be a hymn of hatred and revenge, unquote. It was in this frame of mind, Steinberg recalled, that Lenin demanded, in his phrase, mass terror and the shooting of hundreds of prostitutes, as well as, he demanded, the immediate arrest of non-Bolshevik revolutionaries, the killing of, quote, entire families, unquote, and the introduction by the Cheka was the name of the secret police, the first secret police, the introduction, he demanded, of physical torture by the Cheka. He called for maximum cruelty, not only against opponents, but also against workers who did not identify their interests with his. He suspected criminal weakness if a Bolshevik favored less cruel tactics, arguing it might be more effective. That was true of Stalin as well. Bolshevik leader Lev Kamenev recounted a group picnic where someone asked, "What's the best thing in the world?" Kamenev replied, "Books." Radek replied, "A woman." For Stalin, it was revenge. Quote, "My greatest pleasure is to choose one's victim, prepare one's plan minutely, slake an impossible vengeance, and then go to bed. There's nothing sweeter in the world," unquote. Those who doubt Kamenev's veracity say he invented the story not to discredit Stalin, but amazingly enough, to ingratiate himself with him. In Pale Horse, Vanya compares the hero George to a cabman who lost everything in a fire and takes out his spite, quote, by lashing his horse across the eyes. That's just what you're doing, George. You want to lash everyone across the eyes. Indeed, Vanya explains, that's true of us all. Quote, "What do we live by, my friend? We live by bare hatred. We don't know how to love." Part 5 is called Martyrdom. Among women terrorists, especially those with a religious background, the goal was often martyrdom. One recent critic explains, quote, "Self-sacrifice for many revolutionary women became a goal in itself. Helping others was secondary to the true goal of satisfying the thirst for martyrdom," unquote. Goals only pollute sacrifice by making it utilitarian and so impure. Fascinated in girlhood by Jesus' death, Zasulich never prayed to him because she didn't want him to save her. On the contrary, "I wanted to save him," she said. Looking for faith, she retained her desire for a crown of thorns. Well, after losing her faith, she still retained the desire for a crown of thorns. The danger of violence was its point. Even those not seeking martyrdom found self-sacrifice appealing. When Vera Figner joined the terrorist organization People's Will, she was required to, quote, "forget all ties of kinship and all personal sympathies, love, and friendships, taking no thought of anything else and sparing no one and nothing, to have no personal properties, to renounce all one's individual desires," unquote. Far from discouraging her and others, these prescribed sacrifices proved appealing. Indeed, she explained, if these demands had been less exigent, they would not have satisfied us. Part 6 is called Self-Assertion. The fact that such motives for violence are entirely selfish did not disturb Savinkov in the least. In Pale Horse, George laughs at Vanya's concern with other people. Quote, "You sound like a parish priest, George says. Vanya replies, "So be it, but tell me, can one live without love?" George, "Of course." Vanya, "How?" George, "You just spit at the whole world." Sheer self-assertion motivates George as it evidently motivated Savinkov himself. George explains, quote, "I'm on the border of life and death. What do I care for words about sin? I say to myself," and I looked and beheld a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death. That's a quotation from the book of Revelation. "In the presence of that horse, there is no life, and therefore no law," unquote. Such a terrorist kills for himself, and George eventually murders a romantic rival. In the past, he says, "I could justify killing, it's necessary for the revolution. But now," quote, "I have killed for myself. Why is it all right to kill for the terror, but for oneself impossible? Who will answer me?" He has embraced pure self-assertion. This is a positive hero of the novel. Right? Other people are not real to George, who compares life to a puppet show. Quote, "The curtain is risen and we are on stage. Pale Pierrot has fallen in love with Pierrette.
Pierrette has a fiancé. A toy pistol fires and blood flows, red cranberry juice. A street organ squeaks off stage. Curtain, unquote. As others worry about right and wrong, George continues, quote, the tedious merry-go-round turns. People fly into the flame like moths. And does it really matter? Is life vaudeville or drama? Cranberry juice or blood? A farce or real life? I don't know. Who does? Unquote. As one of the superior ones grasping the truth, George looks down from his window on people, quote, rushing around like black ants, each one as busy with his petty cares of the day. I despise them. Since I have no God, I shall be my own God. In Savinko's other novel, What Never Happened, terrorist Olga explains, quote, if a man has resolved on everything, understood everything, if he has looked into the abyss and felt no terror, to a man like that, all is permissible. You hear? All. For him, there is no sin, no forbidden thing, no crime. Unquote. Part 7 is called Liberal Self-Destruction. The mystique of the revolutionist enchanted many peaceful folk. Without their support, the revolutionaries would not have won. Terrorists occupied the moral high ground. Terrorist Vera Figner explained that society, meaning high society, could not resist, quote, the magnetic charm of the cult of dynamite and the revolver, unquote. So common was terror that, quote, she says, society saw no escape from the existing dangerous condition. One group sympathized with the violence practiced by the party, while others regarded it as only a necessary evil, but even they applauded the valor and skill of the champion. Besides, the repetition of such events made them a normal part of society's life, unquote, and respectable people regarded it as bad taste to be shocked. Although it did not practice violence, the Russian Liberal Party, the cadets from constitutional Democrats, collected funds for terrorists. Historians often explain the support as a tactic. If the Tsar was forced to yield some political power, the cadets would be the beneficiaries. Well, maybe, but the charm of revolutionism also played a significant role. Neither the cadet party nor its newspaper, Riech, ever denounced terrorism, even when revolutionaries tossed explosives into Riga's streetcars or threw bombs made more lethal by the addition of nails and bullets into a large family cafe with 200 customers in order, quote, to see how the foul bourgeois would squirm in death agony, unquote. When a confused terrorist murdered an elderly man she mistook for the Minister of the Interior, Riech opined, quote, in these difficult times, it does not matter if there is one person more or less in the world, unquote. Cadet leader N.N. Shupkin declared that the party, quote, no longer considers the so-called political criminals to be criminals, unquote. On the contrary, they were described as saints. Amazingly enough, the cadets condemned all government attempts to defend itself. Terrorists were confident that if caught, they would be rescued by liberal lawyers and public opinion. One police official described the paralyzing, demoralizing effect of leniency on the regime's defenders. Quote, the latest verdicts in political trials are truly horrifying. For after several months, all those convicted returned to the path of revolutionary activity with redoubled energy, unquote. Shortly after Stolypin became chair of the Councils of Ministers in 1906, terrorists tossed bombs into his residence during an open house he was holding for petitioners. 27 people were killed and 32 wounded, including Stolypin's 2 children. In fact, assassinations were a daily event. The commander of the Black Sea Fleet and the governors of Saratov and Warsaw died at the hands of terrorists. Monarchists responded with counter-terror. As historian Richard Pipes pointed out, quote, "No government could have remained passive in the face of such violence," unquote. Stolypin introduced field courts to try and sometimes execute those whose guilt was egregious and obvious. This law remained in effect for 8 months. Outraged liberals condemned Stolypin, but not the terrorists. One cadet leader famously referred to the new gallows as Stolypin's neckties, and the phrase, Russians know that phrase to this day. Although the Tsar granted a political amnesty, the cadets insisted on total amnesty, meaning to include terrorists pledged to continue killing. Who was being terrorized by whom? Solzhenitsyn asked. After all, far more government officials and terrorists died, and most of the dead or wounded were ordinary citizens. Cadet leader Petrunkevich declared, quote, "Condemn terror? Never! That would mean the moral death of the party," unquote. Didn't the liberals see that they were playing with fire? Before 1917 was over, and the Bolsheviks only took power in the end of October. Before the year was over, the Bolsheviks proclaimed the cadets to be enemies of the people who were outside the law, which meant anyone could do anything to them. Almost immediately, 2 of their leaders, who were patients in the Petersburg hospital, were lynched. The Bolsheviks sentenced not only the cadets, but also the other revolutionary parties to annihilation. From the very start, the Bolsheviks arrested the families, including the children, of renowned non-Bolshevik revolutionaries. The 11-year-old daughter of socialist leader Viktor Chernov spent weeks of semi-starvation in an icy cell in the infamous Lubyanka prison. Many non-Bolshevik revolutionaries were shocked that the Bolsheviks would treat them much worse than the Tsars had ever done, and that the terror they had directed at others was now directed at them. Since Lenin never concealed his preference for violence and his absolute intolerance of any disagreement, their naivete was all the more remarkable. Could the reason for their surprise and for cadet applause of terrorism lie in the mystique of the revolutionist and the magical appeal of political violence itself? Part 8 is called The Slide. Numerous critics have noticed what might be called the slide, the tendency to adopt ever more extreme violence. It happened in many countries, notably during the French Revolution. Each time the more radical party wins, it splits into factions, the most radical of which condemns the rest, and the process repeats. Winners, turned into losers, are usually surprised. From killing specific people when necessary, Russian terrorists advanced to killing random people whenever possible. Soon, sadism became common. Geifman explains, quote, "The need to inflict pain was transformed from an abnormal compulsion by unbalanced personalities into a formally verbalized obligation for all committed revolutionaries," unquote. Some people were thrown into vats of boiling water. Others were mutilated both before and after death. When Stalin, himself a former terrorist bandit, introduced torture as the normal investigatory procedure in 1937, for basically everybody, he was drawing on revolutionary tradition. What explains this dynamic, which happens in place after place, time and again? One historian points to yet another motive for terrorism as an end in itself: the craving of lonely young people for an especially tightly knit community, a family bound by the imminence of death. That craving proved especially intense with adolescents and children. Once committed to the life of a professional revolutionary, a young person formed, quote, "close ties in the process of apprenticeship, commitment, shared sacrifice, and satisfying organizational work. In short, socialization in a sort of radical fraternity called the party." It was this socialization that created the emotional basis for acceptance and escalation to increasingly more extreme tactics. When Stalin accused old Bolsheviks of preposterous crimes that they could not possibly have committed, they confessed, this explanation goes, because they could not imagine life outside the party. When the condemned Bolshevik leader, who was the hero of Arthur Koestler's famous novel Darkness at Noon, reviews his life, he finds that it does not exist outside the party. Quote, his past was the movement, the party. It was identical with it, unquote. The dynamic of ever-increasing violence derives from yet another cause. For those addicted to the thrill of intense moments, violence soon becomes routine and ceases to have the desired effect. As with addictive drugs, ever-increasing doses are needed. Violent struggle against everydayness becomes an everyday affair that one must struggle against still more violently. When the Bolsheviks seized power, they hastened to employ terror. A decree on Red Terror, the Bolsheviks adopted the term proudly, issued on December 20th, 1917, created the infamous Cheka, the secret police. And in 1918, the Politburo began organizing concentration camps. That's their term. Lenin made absolutely clear that Bolsheviks were to regard terror not as a last resort, but as the default position. To staff the rapidly growing Cheka, Lenin recruited former terrorists, even those who would oppose the Bolsheviks, so long as they were sufficiently brutal. The readiness to work for one's erstwhile opponents reflects the spirit of revolutionism, where ideology matters less than the practice of terrorism itself. Part 9 is called Terrorists as Rulers, and it begins with a quotation from a poem in the anthology called Cheka Smile, Secret Police Smile, right? And the line from the poem is, there is no greater joy, there is no better music than a crushing sound of smashed bones and lives. They had a gift for poetry, right? If I hadn't found it in the sources, I wouldn't have believed that existed. What would those addicted to terror do when they were rulers? The answer was, in Geifman's words, quote, unrestricted violence on real and alleged counter-revolutionaries, as well as the peaceful population of remote areas. Mass murder, robbery, rape, beatings, and torture were common. Startling sadism was rampant, unquote. We usually think of mass terror as Stalin's idea, but that is a mistake. The mass terror that characterized Soviet rule in the 1930s resumed Leninist practice, which in turn grew directly out of the Russian terrorist tradition. The glee with which Bolshevik leaders encouraged, indeed required, violence is still shocking. They explicitly condemned concern for human life as evidence of religious leanings. And so the best way to prove one's loyalty was to be as brutal as possible. Trotsky demanded Bolsheviks, quote, put an end once and for all to the papist Quaker babble about the sanctity of human life, unquote. From the start, the Cheka executed people randomly. Justice Commissar Nikolai Krylenko explained, quote, we must execute not only the guilty, execution of the innocent will impress the masses even more, unquote. Lenin called for public hanging as especially impressive. During the Red Terror, the government decreed that, quote, class enemies and their relatives be dispatched to concentration camps. No czar ever sort of sent, the wife and children of some radical to prison. Stalin's policy of arresting families, relatives, and even ex-spouses of enemies of the people only drew on previous Bolshevik practice. Again, continuing the practice of some pre-revolutionary terrorists, the Cheka made torture routine. This is in the early days. Local Cheka units developed expertise in particular ways of inflicting pain. One local group specialized in scalping, another in burning alive, another in crucifixion. The Kiev Cheka put prisoners in a coffin with a decaying body. S. Smelgunov wrote in his study, Red Terror in Russia, quote, throughout the country, Chekists tortured old men, raped schoolgirls, and killed parents before their children's eyes. They impaled people and locked them in cells where corpses covered the floor, unquote. Lenin, believe it or not, regarded his agents as too soft. If we are guilty of anything, he maintained, it is of having been too humane, too benevolent. Lenin's decrees listed people to shoot by categories, followed by the chilling word, etc. One directive demanded, quote, mass terror immediately to execute and exterminate. You'd think one of those would be enough, execute or exterminate, right? No, it has to execute and exterminate. Hundreds of prostitutes, drunken soldiers, former officers, etc., unquote. You know, you're in the etc. class. When the Petrograd Soviet restrained elements practicing random terror, Lenin reversed them. Quote, this is unheard of. The energy and mass nature of the terror must be encouraged, unquote. More than Machiavellian ruthlessness was involved here. The Red Terror was also revolutionism without limit. Lenin declared, quote, when we are reproached with cruelty, we wonder how people can forget the most elementary Marxism, unquote. He made clear that terror was no temporary expedient for revolutionary years, but must become a permanent feature of Soviet society. When Justice Commissar Kursky was formulating the new legal code, Lenin instructed, quote, the law should not abolish terror. It should be substantiated and legalized in principle without evasion or embellishment, unquote. Part 10 is called the revolutionist suicide. The tumult did subside, if only temporarily. The mass famine created by abolishing money and relying solely on force to make peasants surrender grain, creating a famine, obviously, compelled the regime to adopt the so-called new economic policy, restoring some market activity. The respite was to be as brief as possible. Lenin wrote, quote, it is the biggest mistake to think the new economic policy will put an end to the terror. We shall return to the terror and to economic terror, unquote. At the same time, the new economic policy struck many as a betrayal of revolutionary hopes. Especially distressing to revolutionists was the return to everyday life. The disappointed belief that the liminal condition might continue forever and revolutionary thrill never end occasioned a special revolutionist's suicide. In the poem attached to his suicide note, poet Vladimir Mayakovsky famously lamented, quote, love's boat has smashed against everydayness, unquote. Historians have often wondered how Stalin persuaded millions of people to turn on each other. Why did so many young idealists flock to the countryside, for instance, to enforce a famine engineered, this is in the 30s, to kill millions of peasants, to take bits of food from emaciated families, starving before their very eyes? How did the regime recruit so many willing to torture innocent people? Stalin offered, I think the answer is, Stalin offered a return to revolutionary fervor. Once again, anything was possible. Stalin once even had to ease the widespread belief that Bolsheviks can literally achieve anything in defiance of the laws of nature, which were supposedly not binding on Bolsheviks. Far from betraying revolutionary hopes, as anti-Stalinist Marxists have claimed, Stalinist terror revived them. It is worth noting that Western intellectual sympathy for the Soviet regime, once so far-reaching, almost disappeared when the regime became less repressive. Terror appealed to the revolutionary, to the revolutionism in so many of us. Part 11 is called Grossman's Question. Vasily Grossman's great novel, entitled Life and Fate, asks, why did so many not only accept unprecedented cruelty to others, but even rush to their own annihilation? Mystified, Grossman ponders, quote, cases of huge queues being formed by people awaiting execution. Millions lived in vast camps that had not only been built by prisoners, but even guarded by them, unquote. For Grossman, the 20th century, he also wrote about the Holocaust, demonstrates that revolutionism, almost irrespective of ideology, can lead people to do anything. The magic of the revolution renders destruction and murder sacred. I quote from his novel. How else can one explain the way certain intelligent thinking Jews declared the slaughter of the Jews to be necessary for the happiness of mankind? How else can one explain the case of a gifted, intelligent poet, himself a peasant by birth, who with sincere conviction wrote a long poem celebrating the terrible sufferings undergone by the peasantry that had swallowed up his own father, unquote. Revolutionism inspires people to do what they never would have done otherwise. And by making it habitual, it demands ever higher doses. Westerners often express surprise at Stalin's doctrine of the intensification of the class struggle, that is, intensification of violence, after the revolution had crushed opposition. That was the doctrine that justified liquidating millions. Why go to the trouble and expense of employing countless interrogators to torture people into confessing obviously imaginary crimes? Many regimes destroy their enemies, but why murder the unshakably loyal? Even Hitler did not execute top personnel, generals and admirals, more than 90% of them, on the eve of war, as Stalin did. Neither did Hitler have his secret police address tens of thousands of loyal people, including many secret police agents, who one day interrogated others and the next day were interrogated themselves. Nor did he persuade the German people that all who made the revolution, except himself, were foreign agents. Stalin did all this, things that neither Hitler nor any other tyrannical leader had ever done before or could have done. Why? Historian Adam Ulam observed, quote, there is in Stalinist terror an element of sheer preposterousness which defies explanation, unquote. If one is looking for the usual sort of rational explanation, it may be true that Stalin's actions make no sense. But if one grasps the logic of revolutionism, which demands constant intensification, shock, and deliberate defiance of everyday thinking, they fit the revolutionary pattern, now with unlimited power at the revolutionists' disposal. And the last section is called Dr. Zhivago's Regret. No matter the consequences, revolutionary hopes never die. In his study, Revolutionary Dreams, historian Richard Stites, whom I quoted before, cites memoirist Lev Kopolyev's, quote, rosy memories of the 20s. Today we know that the romantic revolutionary passions we recalled so many times with such sweet sorrow degenerated into a fervent desire to serve as executioners. But all the same, Kopelyev asserts, these revolutionary passions should be cherished. Quote, I still think that the time was alive and bursting with youth, not only with my tender youth and that of the people of my own age, but with the youth of the century, unquote. And Richard Stites, the American historian here, actually agrees. To be sure, he says, it may be natural in the second half of the 20th century, the most self-consciously brutal in the history of mankind, to scorn utopian ideals, I'm still quoting, but what virtue is more admired in the whole catalog of human art and sensibility than childlike enthusiasm? What is more lamented than our loss of youth, romance, openness to change, and thirst for adventure? These characteristics of the utopian imagination appeal to every generation that discovers it. The warming springtime of human hopes is born again, forever and ever. That perpetual vitality is precisely what, in Pasternak's novel, Dr. Zhivago fears. It ensures that experience if it is remembered at all, will never matter. Quote, "What an enviable blindness," thought the doctor. "Don't they remember their own plans and measures? What kind of people are they to go on raving with this never-cooling feverish ardor year in, year out, to know nothing, to see nothing," unquote. One lesson of the Russian experience is that the danger of revolutionism is not confined to the destruction it immediately causes. It may lead to ever more horror, exceeding anything presently imaginable. Another is that no consequences will extinguish the youthful appeal of the thrilling, dangerous, and addictive violence of the devoted revolutionist. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are going to open it up now to question and answer. We'll have about half an hour available for question and answer. So if you have a question that you would like to ask Dr. Morson, please raise your hand. We have microphones that can be sent your way. Very good. I see some hands up. Let's start with Mr. Huck right here. Well, I suppose we have
Okay, so these violent revolutions, you see these people want to completely destroy institutions and implement very quick change. And
I'm not sorry, say it again.
So with the revolutions you're talking about, they seek to destroy institutions and have quick change. And with the American Revolution, the people, and also with the violent revolution, have new people in power. And with the American Revolution, you see that the elitists were the people that still carried it out, and we still kept the same institutions, just got UK or Britain out of it, and we sought to just get slow change. So my question is, in order to have a successful revolution, are institutions and slow change necessary?
Well, you asked a wonderful question. I think it's a mistake to think of the American Revolution as a revolution. It was a war for national independence. Nobody had the idea of overturning society. Nobody was going to seize George Washington's estates. Nobody was going to change the class structure. It was simply get rid of the foreign ruler. It's not, it's only, by honorific of the time that the word revolution was applied. It's not a revolution like the French Revolution, or the Russian Revolution, or the Chinese Revolution. So once you know that, then the question becomes, do you get better results by gradual change or by overturning all institutions at once? And I think the answer to that is there is no revolution that has ever made things better. Say, if you assume the revolution is not a revolution.
Thank you. Ms. Daly?
What do you believe the January 6th riots say about the development of the revolutionary spirit and development of prevention?
Say January 6th riots.
Yeah, what does the January 6th riots say about the development of the revolutionary spirit in America, Prevention America, and the status of our democracy?
Was it a manifestation of the revolutionary spirit on January 6th? Is that
yes, what does it say about the development of the revolutionary spirit when it happened and in our response to it as well?
Well, I'm no expert on this or lots of American things, so what I say doesn't really matter very much. But I find it hard to imagine that an excited mob, doing absurd things constitutes a revolution. I mean, nobody really thought it was going to overthrow society, mob, capital. I mean, this is not a revolution. This is what happens when a group of thoughtless people, get worked up and have, sticks and stones in their hand. What do? They go and, invade the first thing they can and they cause trouble. It's not a revolution. Again, I could be wrong. There are things I don't know here. But it strikes me as, kind of a typical piece of mob violence at a very touchy political time. And mob violence has never been a good thing.
Mr. Story?
So I wonder about a couple of these assassinations, Alexander II in I think 81, and then Stolypin in 1911. And when Alexander is killed, it seems random, right? It doesn't seem fitting. It seems like he was being successful, he was good, he was progressive, he was modernizing, and then suddenly, sorry.
You're talking about Alexander II?
Yes, then he's cut down. But then with Stolypin, his assassination seems inevitable. He's a kind of similar figure. He's trying to modernize, but he's also trying to tamp down a revolution. So it seems kind of natural that he would be killed by a terrorist attack that he was trying to stop and profit himself. My point is, do you think Stolypin could have prevented the revolution? Was there a turning point between 1881 and 1911 where the revolution became this kind of inevitable beast which could not be stopped?
Stolypin was trying to create prosperity among the peasantry by changing the way they have land, among others. Lenin believed that if he succeeded, there would be no revolution. Lenin thought, this is the greatest danger we face. He didn't have to be assassinated. He wasn't, if he'd only been wearing a bulletproof vest, he'd been advised that day, he wouldn't have been assassinated. It wasn't inevitable that he'd be assassinated before he kind of reformed. I mean, even if he had been, was it inevitable that, the ruler, Nicholas II, was, not to put too fine a point on it, a moron? If that, I mean, he may have been stupid. It's amazing that he, a better question is, how did a moron like that even wind up with a good guy like Stolypin? I don't know how to answer that one. But, the rest of the time he was hanging out with people like Rasputin. Oh, I'm sorry. Grab this one here. That's fun.
I have a quick question. You mentioned thoughtless people engaging in nonviolence, and you were speaking about the thrill of revolution. And I didn't hear much about ideals of freedom or justice. Is what you were describing something more akin to nonviolence? I mean, what happened to these ideals? Was there agreement about these ideals, repudiation of these ideals?
Well, what you get with this particular psychology is that the ideals don't really matter. They're window dressing, but they don't really make any difference. What you like is being at a thrilling moment, sort of like, with drugs or gambling, and there's an enormous thrill to that. Of course, there are people who were also, not all revolutionaries were revolutionists. There were some who really were trying to achieve specific goals. But I can tell you, none of them would have listed freedom as one of the goals. Because they all believed that they had the formula for the perfect society, like Lenin. And the last thing you do, if you know exactly the right thing to do, is to allow people to do something else. I mean, Lenin believed that that Marxism was a science, as certain, or more certain actually, than physics, right? I mean, that's why in the Soviet period, if quantum physics or relativity conflicted with Marxism, Leninism, it was relativity theory that had to go, because it clearly couldn't be right. That was really how science worked in the Soviet Union. He thought he had a hard science. So if you believe this, do you allow disagreement? I mean, I don't know. Do you allow two parties to debate the Pythagorean theorem? That's what, so the groups, the revolutionaries as opposed to the revolutionists had goals, but the goals were, involved creating utopia through mass violence to change the world. And, you want to say, well, will it ever stop? Will the violence ever stop? Well, since they're not going to create utopia, they'll have to have an explanation for why it didn't happen. And the explanation is always sabotage or foreign agents. And sabotage or foreign agents leads
to justifications for more violence. They're never going to say, maybe violence wasn't the best way to do this. No. So it will feed on itself. It won't end. Another way to think about this is you have a group of people who spend their lives practicing violence and encouraging others to practice violence. Do you think when they gain power, they're suddenly going to be gentle? Why would anyone think that?
Great, I see several hands up. Dr. Nelson?
Thank you. What has to break in a society to produce revolutionists on the scale that you've been talking about? What are the social causes? Because this doesn't happen in every society. It happened in Russia, or it happened in France. So what has to break to give rise to these kinds of people who feel no compunction to commit these acts?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question for which, I spent a lot of time thinking about. I mean, there was certainly, enough grievances to get people upset in Tsarist Russia. It was, far and away the model of a repressive society in Europe. No society compared with it, right? There was ample reason for people to be angry with it. But that isn't quite sufficient. You mentioned Alexander II. The terrorist movement began under Alexander II, who liberated the serfs. There's never been probably a reform in history that affected more people, of a population, over 70% of the population. Then changed the judicial system from top to bottom to be more like Western norms. Changed the time of service in the army, enormously reducing it. Peasants who were in the army who were illiterate were taught how to read and write, so when they got out of the army, they would know. It was, the reforms go on and on. There was never remotely such a series of reforms, in Russia, from Peter the Great to the Revolution, right? And it would be an extraordinary record in anybody's society. So, and he was the one who was first assassinated and gave birth to the terrorist movement. So I don't think it was the grievances that did it, even though there certainly were enough grievances to justify it, if it could. I think there was a certain dynamic in the sociology of the intelligentsia itself. And, they commented on this themselves. Intelligentsia is a word we get from Russian. But in Russian, it does not mean intellectuals or educated people. It means, to be a member of the intelligentsia, you have to be a revolutionary, an atheist, and a materialist. And you have to live a certain sort of anti-bourgeois lifestyle, and lots of other things. So no one would have ever thought of, let's say, Leo Tolstoy, who used his title of Count and believed in God, as a member of the intelligentsia. It would have been absurd. But there was a dynamic within this group that, made the slide work. That is, you proved your authenticity by being more and more violent or radical over the decades, or extreme in your philosophical statements. That can exist, I think, sociologically, independently of anything else in a society. Of course, if the society is as repressive as Tsarist Russia, they'll get followers, because they can certainly use real grievances. I mean, the situation of the peasants, even after being freed, was horrible. It was better, by the way, that the American slaves who we freed without land. Imagine doing that. It always boggles my mind that you could free people, an agricultural people, and not give them land. But the Russian peasants at least were given land. Not very much, but they were given. It was recognized there. But still, their conditions were just terrible. And when factory workers started, we know what those situations were like. So there was always a ready fountain of grievance to draw on. But the thing is, no reforms. If you look, for example, at the programs of the revolutionaries, what would they want if Alexander II? What reforms should have Alexander II did that he didn't? Basically, they were saying they wanted complete utopia, and anything short of that wouldn't do. So there was no reforms that he could have done that would have satisfied. This suggests an internal dynamic of the group to me. even though there were a lot of external things feeding it. I don't know if that works. I'm not sure this is correct. Some of the, I'm sort of drawing on some of the people commenting at the time who were fascinated by this. But there certainly can be a sociology of the intelligentsia which has a relative independence from the rest of society. I don't know if that convinces you, and I'm not completely convinced myself, but that's the direction I'm thinking.
Rob, I see this hand up right here.
Thank you. So I would like to ask about the end of the revolution, which so far, of course, the gist I've been getting is that it doesn't really end, at least in theory. It kind of just escalates and continues getting more and more violent. But of course, in the course of history, it did ultimately come to an end. I believe you mentioned famine earlier in reference to that. But it's going in and out. All right.
So I've been talking or hearing in one of my other classes about Gorbachev and the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union. And the impression I've gotten from Gorbachev is that he was, my person calls him a true believer, that he genuinely believed in all of the ideals of the revolution, but was perhaps less radical about it than, say, Stalin and Lenin and all of those figures. And as he kind of tries to implement these ideas as ideas rather than being motivated by the revolutionary spirit, he comes up against internal contradictions, and ultimately it leads to the collapse of the system. And so I'm wondering if that's inevitable whenever you have these revolutionary ideas that sort of, once the fire is faded, stick around, people try to build a society after them. Do they inevitably just fall apart? Or can you make something out of them?
There's a lot of good points there. I tend to see Gorbachev he thought of himself as believing in socialism. And socialism, means government control of industry from top to bottom, the means of production and distribution. And somehow, the image that he was brought up in his mind, any alternative to that, is not. So we can think of an alternative to that, let's say Denmark, a capitalist welfare state. And that's not, he thinks of the way he's brought up, the conditions of English factory workers in Manchester as described by Engels. That's what he thinks of as the only alternative, right? So he's a true believer in socialism. But it's not working. It's perfectly plain that it's not working. As you said it, memoir, they always knew that they were behind economically, America and Western Europe. But when they started falling behind Thailand, which they'd always looked down on, that was a psychic blow. Okay? What were they to do? Their theory told them that they had the most advanced, progressive, productive system in the world. So, what you do, you have to, let's have more openness of speech, glossiness. And maybe, we'll reduce some of the tension. Maybe we'll come up with some ideas. But contrasted, I don't think it was contrasted, for example, with what happened in China. They had no political liberalization, or as little as possible, but they created a market economy run, amazingly enough, by a communist party. Right? And I think you have to say that they achieved something there, whether you like it or not. And there's no question that they achieved something by that method that, the Russians didn't achieve by their method. Is this Chinese society still totalitarian? No, I probably wouldn't say that. It's authoritarian, it's not free, but it's nothing like the way it was under Mao. Still, the Communist Party did retain absolute power without rivals, and that by economically modernizing. That is not how Gorbachev proceeded. So maybe it would have been possible. Of course, there's a difference between dealing with, anybody else and dealing with Russians, who are not, as they will say themselves, particularly psychologically adept to, the market and bourgeois activity, right? In fact, the culture is very much runs against it. Maybe that didn't make that an option. I don't know.
This time back here, Mr. Peter.
So, from the talk, it seems pretty clear from the talk that revolution tends to beget terrorism, but does it also work the other way around? Does terrorism beget revolutionism? And how would you say that modern groups of terrorists, the Taliban who've been in the news, Al-Qaeda, even going back to like the IRA, how would you say that those kind of fit into the mold that the Russians and the French kind of formed?
You know, you have to look at each group. My guess is that the Irish Republican Army is very different from, let's say, Hamas or the Taliban, right? And so it'd be hard to generalize. You have to look at each group. How many people in the Irish Republican Army just loved the thrill of violence for its own sake, and how many were simply dedicated to an independent Ireland? I don't know. You have to look. It's an empirical question. If you're dealing with, you know, the Taliban, you're dealing with people, it appears to be, whose terrorism is motivated by, you know, an ideology, right? And if that's the case, the terror is instrumental. It's not an end in itself. Although, of course, for some people, it could become an end in itself. You know, professional terrorists, right? But I think you're more likely to get revolutionism in a democratic society, right? I mean, I'm old enough to remember, you know, the Weathermen, you know, the Students for a Democratic Society, the Red Brigades in Germany and Italy. And these were, of course, they professed their revolutionary ideology, but they had a romance about them that got, you know, people of good, humane, liberal opinion to like them world over and gave them kind of a status, right? They're still romanticized. I'm guessing that, you know, today you're more likely to find revolutionists in a society like ours or Germany, right, than you know, in the Taliban. But I don't really know. You're asking me to speculate. I'm not an expert in these movements.
We still have some time, and I'll get to a couple more hands here. You said a couple of things that struck me during your lecture. One was the idea, you were quoting someone, that the thrill subsides with everydayness. The revolutionary thrill subsides with everydayness. And you also mentioned that hatred was linked with violence. So, in what way might concepts like love, grace, or this everydayness quell the kind of revolutionary spirit itself?
Yeah, I mean, you've hit upon a theme in my book, because I devote a chapter. The central debate, one of the central debates in the whole Russian tradition was, you could phrase it this way, is the essence of human life to be found in extreme moments like revolution or, you know, the thrill of gambling or romantic elation? Or is it to be found in the ordinary, everyday? Is a good life one lived well, moment by moment? You know, Tolstoy's novels are dedicated to the notion that what matters is the ordinary fact. His heroes are all looking, you know, into the distance for some great meaning, and they discover it right in the ordinary facts, their sister, right before their eyes all the time. The answers they need are hidden in plain view, right in front of them, in ordinary life, if they live it right. Chekhov sees the world in a very similar way. That's the opposite of what the, you know, intelligentsia sees, and you could trace a debate, you know, from the time of Tolstoy onward on this very question. It's one of the great, you know, Russian questions. It's very complex. You know, some of the, is the greatest evil, okay, the greatest evil in the world certainly comes from highly dramatic things, you know, like the Nazis or, you know, the Gulag. But what about the most evil in the world? And, Tolstoy will say the most evil comes, and Dostoevsky will say, from ordinary neglect even. It doesn't have to be malice, neglect. And what happens at great, awful moments is the product of how people were shaped at ordinary moments. So what really matters is how you look at other people every moment of your life. You look at them charitably or resentfully. Do you take opportunities for small goodnesses and kindnesses, or do you think, oh, that doesn't matter? That shapes you and the culture you're in. And then the big events ultimately derive from that. That's would be what, the other side of the argument, right? The argument that, it's Tolstoy and Chekhov who are mostly associated with that, but there are others who made the argument too. And I wrote a whole chapter to that argument, right there.
I saw it with the two of Mr.
There's someone over there too.
Mr. Place, and we'll go right up, so I don't know your name, but right here, in the green and white shirt. We'll start here, and then go to Mr. Place.
Based on what you've said, would you say that the true outcome of revolution is not the principles that started the revolution, but the aftermath, the cultural and social aftermath that results from the revolution?
The true what now is the...
Would you say the true outcome of any revolution is not the principles that started it, but rather the social and cultural outcomes, the aftermath of that revolution?
It's the aftermath, but the aftermath has the principles have a lot to do with the aftermath. If your principle is, like Lenin's, I have science, a hard science, it's going to affect the outcome, right? If you have the idea of, listen, revolution was not my first choice, but there's no alternative in this case, and we want the violence to be as little as possible, and then set up a nicer, it'll come up with different results, right? That would be a very different sort of thing. And there were a few Russian revolutionaries who, did think that, well, yes, we're revolutionaries, but we want to keep the killing to a minimum. Lenin had utter contempt for those people. But, the anarchist Peter Kropotkin was one of those. You want to set up a society afterwards. You want to minimize ill feeling. You're going to get very different results if you think that way, even if you're a revolutionary, than if you think the other way, right? Not all revolutionaries are identical, and so the results are not going to be identical, I would guess.
Thank you. Mr. Place and Mr. Black. And why don't you go one right after the other, and then we can have Dr. Morson respond to both.
With regard to your statement about why revolutionism is more likely to actually be prevalent in a democratic society than, say, a totalitarian one, do you think that's almost motivated by, not so much ideological viewpoint, but almost like a bloodlust, I guess? A lot of what you're describing as revolutionism almost seems just like an insatiable bloodlust, like I want everything to burn and I want to laugh while I watch kids watch their parents be murdered in the most inhumane ways.
Yeah, one of the slogans of my generation was simply "Burn, baby, burn."
But I guess what I'm saying is, do you think, what are the differences between just sheer insatiable bloodlust and revolutionism, or are there any at all?
Well, let's get the other question, then I'll answer the two questions.
I think it was in part 6 or part 7 of your talk, you quoted somebody who said, since I don't have a God, I will be my own.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of Kirillov from Demons.
Yeah.
And so, for Kirillov, he was like, I figured it out, I'll just kill myself. But for this for this person that you were quoting, what was their means of becoming God?
But if you're thinking theologically, in the Russian Orthodox branch of Christianity, they would think that, I mean, the way they would phrase their theology often is something like this. God became man so that man might become God. Okay, that's the reason for the incarnation, so that we could eventually achieve divine status too. But there's all the difference in the world between the idea of the God-man, God becoming man, and the man-God. Man exalting himself to divine status so he can do anything, right? And that's the other God, Kirillov is trying to become the man-God, not the God-man. Stavrogan points out, the difference in that book. And human beings are capable of a lot of really bad things. If they start thinking they're gods, things are going to get really bad, right? That's what human nature is. Right? The question about bloodlust. Bloodlust certainly feeds revolution, and the hardcore revolutionaries know how to use it. The revolutionists are not going to win out. It's the hardcore revolutionaries who will. But they can use the revolutionists. But, the bloodlust you talk about, it's romantic. It's the romanticization of violence. And, in our society, I tend to draw a connection between that and the consumerism of our society, where, a new taste sensation, the more intense something is, the more transcendent some life experience is. The sort of watered down, 19th century romanticism has run through Madison Avenue. But the idea of, your ordinary life doesn't matter. It's the thrill that matters, right? I don't know. Tolstoy dedicated his life to try to exposing what's wrong with that idea. But to do it, you have to expose what's wrong with the whole romantic view of the world. And the romantic view of the world has enormous appeal. And it's ultimately, you're not going to get rid of it. Although you might. So, and, the look, in the 19th century, it was fairly common to romanticize war. We think of, how can you romanticize war, which is killing? And the answer is, you see the Che Guevara posters? They're romanticizing killing. He's a killer. Revolution is killing. The way we romanticize today, revolution, in the 19th century, early 19th century was war, right? As well as revolution. What's the difference? Both, if you romanticize any kind of violence, you're asking for a lot of it. So I'm always reluctant to, listen, you may need it, but you don't celebrate it.
Please join me in thanking Dr.